for those Mets fans, Shea Stadium came down and they built Citi Field. Yankee Stadium came down and they built a new Yankee Stadium. Our infrastructure here is outdated, and right here on Long Island, we can do more to improve our local air quality by upgrading our infrastructure, which is important, by the way, because if we don't do it now, we should have done it a long time ago, we are going to start having to beg local states and other places for cheaper energy. We're setting ourselves up to fail here on Long Island, and we're also getting to the point where my family, almost all of my family now lives in Florida. And we have seniors who are choosing between whether or not to put oil in their tank or prescription medication. Their house might be paid off, but their property taxes almost eat up all of their fixed income. So all of these that affect our cost of living, yeah, I oppose the Clean Power Plan rule, and I oppose the idea of supporting something that will double our rates.
I want to start by saying that way early in this campaign, I made a statement many a time that my plan was to join the Bipartisan Climate Change Caucus, and I'm happy to hear that that caused him to do the same. I hope that he's there for positive rather than negative reasons. How do we reduce the cost of energy for taxpayers and residents on Long Island? And how do we do it while protecting our environment? Because the cost of not protecting our environment is going to cost you as taxpayers incrementally more for every day that we let that go. So one is not mutually exclusive. If we don't protect our environment, your costs will go up. And if we don't reduce our utility bills, many, he talks about his family, I'm talking about my 4 kids, none of whom live on Long Island anymore because they can't afford it. So how do we marry this? We marry it by investing in alternative energy. I'll go back to the Solarized Southampton program, which led the way on getting people off of dependence on LIPA, reducing their bills, tapping into the NYSERDA program, where if you don't know about it, it's a great program, which entitles you to an energy audit of your home. It entitles you to find out what you can do to reduce your cost and your dependence on fossil fuels, and the difference in what you are saving from your current bill will go to paying for the upgrades, and eventually you will get down to a 0 bill because you will be on alternative energy. We are so well poised right here on Long Island. We have wind, we have sun, and we have water. We are so poised to get entirely off of fossil fuel plants and getting our cost for utility down to almost nothing. We should be leading the way on that.
Okay, the next question has to do with the Wells Fargo fraud. Can you comment on the fraud and whether you believe, as some do, that the only way to stop Wall Street fraud is if executives that preside over such fraud face criminal charges? Congressman Zeldin?
Well, I'm surprised the CEO of Wells Fargo hasn't been replaced. I mean, as a CEO, he's facing pretty intense criticism from all sides in Congress. It's one of those rare moments where you see the most liberal Democrats and the most conservative Republicans all commenting about how shameful it is, because we all have constituents all across the entire country that who have been harmed by the actions of Wells Fargo. Unfortunately, there's been more accountability and transparency, but it really needs to result in the CEO of Wells Fargo to be replaced. Quite frankly, he has a duty he has a fiduciary duty, he has a legal obligation to run his company better than what he did, and there are criminal statutes which there should be investigations to decide what kind of punishment would be appropriate in this case. I will say that it might be popular to beat up on every single business as if it's all this this CEO and it's all this company. There are other companies where you have CEOs and you have business practices that need to improve, where you see constituents of mine and constituents of other districts being victimized by businesses. But I also believe at the same exact time that we need to improve our economy, that we need to create more good-paying private sector jobs, that when we are holding accountable one CEO, one company, that we aren't enacting policies that might result in that local community bank on Long Island, that local credit union to be able to have to spend a lot of money on compliance and make it harder for them to compete against bigger companies. There are a lot of proposals that have come out in recent years that have harmed our local credit unions, our local community banks as a result of going after some of the bigger ones.
What my opponent is talking about is code for deregulating in the kind of way that caused the mortgage industry meltdown, which so many of you either were or knew someone who was the victim of. And that is a big tug of war going on right now. And again, when you're talking about bipartisanship, that is not happening in Congress today. The kinds of regulations that needed to be in place to make sure that the Wells Fargo fraud didn't happen, and that millions of people were protected from something like that. Does that mean that we shouldn't be supporting the 21st century economy and commerce? Absolutely we should. And not having the discussion on that, not updating Dodd-Frank to make sure that the kind of fraud and just defrauding people like yourselves cannot happen. Just like the mortgage industry defaulted and so many people were hurt by that, we have to come together and understand what the 21st century economy looks like. But we have to make sure that it is protecting middle-class, hardworking people like we have right here in District 1, New York. And when we are talking about a tax code that my opponent has consistently voted to give tax breaks to the top 1 or 2% of earners, to big corporations, to not prevent the inversions that are happening and corporations that are going abroad and parking their earnings outside and being able to defer those tax dollars from coming back to our shores. Giving away the store to big oil, just big oil itself. That's $40 billion of tax revenue. And when you're giving away the store, the way his majority is, we are paying hardworking, middle-class taxpayers are paying the brunt of that. That's what I'm going to change.
Education has been a hot topic in the news. This is going to be kind of long because there were two questions that both seemed that they were good questions or good ideas. Some people think that our educational system is broken and some do not. Where do you stand on this issue, and can you give one example of how the educational system can be improved? The second part of this is both the federal and state government have imposed a standardized education curriculum and high-stakes testing on our public schools. Parents are fighting back by opting out in large numbers. How will you support public education from standardization, taken over by charters and vouchers, takeover by charters and vouchers for parochial and public schools? Do you think the free market belongs in public education?
I'm going to try to take that as a one-part question, even though I feel like I could go like 9 parts to your question. Great question. Okay, so we have to improve the quality of education. I'm someone who believes that we must challenge our students. I don't believe that Common Core is the answer. We've had a terrible implementation of Common Core in New York State. You have standards all across the entire country under these Common Core standards, tests created by the state, curriculum set by a local school district, and no one was talking to each other. A lot of material that isn't age appropriate. We are also testing kids who might be at a 2nd grade reading level at 10 We're testing them as if they are 5th graders, but they might be at a 2nd grade reading level. We are setting them up to fail. We're injecting them into the Common Core tests after they've spent several years learning in a different model. And you can't get those years back for our students. My mother is a retired public school teacher from Farmingdale. My father's mother is a retired teacher. My father's father was a teacher as well. My daughters go to the same elementary school that I went to in the William Floyd School District, and I went to the State University of New York up in Albany. We have a great education that is provided here on Long Island, but the Common Core implementation has been disastrous. Teachers not only teaching to the test, but teaching to the wrong test because they weren't set up to succeed. When I was a New York State Senator, I introduced legislation to stop Common Core altogether in New York State. The biggest threat that was used against this bill was that if we were to pass it, that we would lose out on federal dollars. There was a U.S. Department of Education official from Washington quoted it in Newsday in the beginning of 2014 that New York State would lose out on money. So I got elected to Congress in 2014, and I got legislation, a legislative proposal passed and signed into law that says a state can opt out of Common Core without penalty from the federal government. The #1 threat against opting out of Common Core in Albany was that we would lose out on hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. Now that threat is gone. I do believe in challenging our students, testing our students, but Common Core isn't right.
I want to start by giving a shout out to some of my friends are here that are part and represent the opt-out movement right here in District 1, New York. I'm with you all the way, as you know, and Suffolk County has been a leader on this. Why? Because it's wrong. The idea that Common Core is the right way to evaluate our kids, is the right way to make sure that our kids are learning what they need to learn, and that they are getting the kind of support services that they need, is so wrong-headed. And I support the fact that we have been a leader right here in District 1, New York, in making sure that we can opt out. So what is at the bottom of all of this? At the bottom of all of this is the income inequality that starts at the very beginning of being born into a school district that is not as well funded as a school district next door that has a higher property tax revenue coming in. Now, you may have heard there's a judge in Connecticut that issued a ruling in Connecticut very recently, just a couple weeks ago, that ordered the Connecticut state government to relook from beginning to end how public schools are funded, to make sure that they're funded equally, regardless of the property tax revenue coming in. That's the kind of national discussion that we need to have. We should not be tying our schools and school budgets to the value of the tax revenue, property tax revenue coming in, because it starts our schools, kids, at a fundamental inequality. Let's talk about higher education too. Let's talk about our kids wanting to go to college. My opponent voted to defund the Pell Grant. Literally tens of thousands of college students right here in District 1, New York, no longer would get Pell Grants if that were to go through.
The next series of questions is on gun control, but they're really sort of yes or no answers, but we're not going to treat them that way. I'll ask them and then you decide how you want to answer them. Number 1, do you support a ban on high-capacity magazines that can hold more than 10 rounds of ammunition? Should people on the no-fly list be banned from being able to buy guns at all? You have both said you would like to see to it that mentally ill people have no access to guns. How would you define mentally ill in this context? I'm going to extend the time on this to 3 minutes because I think you may need it. Ms. Ronholtz, you go first.
Yes and yes on the 2 first, absolutely. And I think most importantly, it's one thing to say that you want to make sure that guns are kept out of the hands of the mentally ill, or out of the hands of terrorists, or out of the hands of criminals, or out of the hands of domestic abusers. It's another thing to not let a single discussion or vote move forward in Congress. 27 times my opponent has voted to not allow the procedural vote to move forward that would allow for that discussion to happen on the floor in the House and to bring forward some of the very basic common sense gun safety laws. One of them is Peter King, right next door in this district, who introduced the no-fly, no-buy, which meant that the individuals on the terrorist watch list who today are prevented from flying commercially because they are considered suspect and perhaps too dangerous, but they are allowed to arm themselves. They are allowed to buy guns and ammunition. And again, my opponent 27 times has voted against allowing that discussion to happen. Now you're going to hear him say, no, look at this bill. And in that bill, which had to do with opioid addiction and funding for that, was again a procedural vote to allow for this discussion to happen. And he voted against it. Did not allow that discussion to happen. The opioid bill, addiction bill, by the way, did pass, but then they voted no for the funding.
That's a lot of really bad information. So what does Pell Grants and the terrorist watch list have in common? Well, first off, I actually voted and the president signed legislation to increase the funding to Pell Grants. As a matter of fact, I introduced the Pell Grant Flexibility Act. So let's put a little bit of facts into it. Now, as far as my opponent's ads go, I would be embarrassed to be here on behalf of my opponent looking at this ad. It lists 25 bill numbers. It says, these are her sources. Look at these bill numbers as the evidence that my opponent voted in favor of terrorists being able to purchase firearms. I'm not even going to tell, I don't have to tell you what it says. I want you, on your own, to go online and type each and every one of those bill numbers in your computer and look for yourself, and you'll realize this, get this, shocking, none of the bills have anything to do with guns. Just digest that. My opponent's TV ad that says I voted 25 times against P. King's bill. If you look them up, each and every one of them had nothing to do with guns. Yes, I did vote in favor of considering the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act to combat the heroin opioid abuse epidemic. And who would have told, and by the way, yes, it is funded. $8.3 billion, as a matter of fact, passed by Congress, signed by the president. But who would have thought that we would get to October and we would be at debates and meet the candidates, and I would have TV ads, or I would have to be here to tell you to go look all the bills up yourself. How do you stand here and say my opponent voted to defund Pell Grants when your opponent voted to increase the amount of Pell Grants passed and signed into law? By the way, all 25 of those votes, P. King voted the same way that I did. Why? Because every one of those 25 votes on her ad had nothing to do with guns. Not even arguably. It has nothing to do with guns. I introduced the Protect America Act. This legislation prevents terrorists from purchasing firearms or explosives. Now, we can have a debate over which one you prefer. Should the burden be on the government to show that someone is a terrorist? Or should the burden be on the purchaser to prove that they're not? Now, by the way, you can be on either side of it. You can have your own opinion. And we should have a debate on it. But you also should respect the opinions of people who believe that there is a process here in our country. And by the way, 97% of the no-fly list are foreigners. And we also have people who are on the list. We have no idea how names get on the list, and we have no idea how names come off the list. And we also have all sorts of names on the list of people who shouldn't have been there in the first place. My bill also helps to clean up the list as well, which is important. So is integrity, honesty. That's important too.
I would like to hear your views on the DREAM Act. It would send a positive message and give these people hope. These kids had no choice about coming here and face being deported to a country they may have no memory of. Congressman?
Which DREAM Act are we talking about?
Actually, who asked this? Who wrote this question?
There are multiple DREAM Acts.
All right,
I wasn't aware there was more than one.
Okay, which DREAM Act are you referring to?
Well, the one where these kids are brought here by their parents when they're little and grow up and they face deportation. Are there more than one DREAM Act? Maybe
The DACA program, which the president, this has been controversial because the president tried to extend the program via executive order. This was ruled to be unconstitutional, went up to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled it to be unconstitutional. We are a nation of immigrants. Every person here has an immigrant story. I also have a lot of compassion for that person who is not here yet, because their family went to the local consulate and says, how do I go to America? How do I pursue the American dream? Hope, opportunity, education. Here's how you do it. And because they followed the rules, they're not here yet. Now listen, there's a lot of places where liberals and conservatives would actually agree on immigration. But what happens is we hold hostage the entire debate over some of the most controversial elements of it. Now, if you tell me this story, if we had 11 million people here, whatever the number is, I've heard a lot of estimates that go higher than 11. You have all these people here, and I hear two extremes of the story.